name. So last week, the title of our session was Visions in the Night, Machazel Laila, and we spent a good deal talking about some of the relationship that the Jewish tradition has to dreams, which has often been an ambivalent relationship, and also took a look at some of the ways in which actually findings that were popularized beginning of the 20th century by Freud and by Jung and by and in the Gestalt world and in others actually had precedence in terms of traditional understandings of dreams. Right, going back even pre-Israelites to the time of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. And even got a chance to talk a little bit in terms of how ancient dream work techniques, particularly those arising in Assyria, actually influence the growth of midrash as we find in the rabbinic tradition. I've actually written a couple of articles about that. So that's sort of some of the territory that we covered last week. Our title for this week is Dreaming During Dark, Hopeful Times. And so let me get off of this share just for a moment here. We'll come back to it so I can see your faces more fully. So a few years ago, when we began to see that there was going to be more of an authoritarian threat here in the United States, let alone what's going on in other places that had been democracies in the West, what is unfolding in Israel, I got it to be interested in what was the impact of authoritarianism on the collective unconscious, right? There was a Nazi whose name I actually referred to, and I'll probably send it out to you. It was a Nazi official who said the only person who lives a private life in Nazi Germany is asleep. Right? The totalitarianism of Hitler and also then Stalin in Russia was very much to break down any barriers and any boundaries that might have given the individual or the family any sense of autonomy whatsoever, right? Because when you're running a police state, right, it's very hard to have friendships in which you can share intimate details, because you're always wondering, is the secret police going to round up my friend and force him or her to inform on me? Or are they going to cop me and then I'm going to have to inform on them? And we actually know from the Russian refusnik community that came out of the Soviet Union to Israel, the United States during the 70s into the 80s, right, that they used to tell us that they used to use code words for baking matzah. Like, oh, you down with a thin crunchy? Because they didn't want to indicate that they were going to actually do a religious observance and bake matzah and share it during the festival of Pesach, right? And so I became very interested in this notion of how authoritarianism affects the collective unconscious and penetrates our dreams. And in the exploration of some of the material, I came across some references to a book that first appeared in the United States, but was published in German language in the 1960s, 1966, by a Jewish woman who had first been a social worker and then a journalist in Nazi Germany, whose name was Charlotte Barat. And she, when the Nazis took over in 1933, she started having nightmares, right? And then started wondering, given her social work background and also his journalism background, like, who else is being affected in their dreams? And so what she started to do was to record people's dreams and get other people to record people's dreams. Doctors, her dressmaker, her hairdresser, who would just casually talk to people, say, oh, did you dream last night? I dreamt last night and that. And they would write them down. She hid the transcripts of these dreams, micro writing, right, and put them in the bindings of books. And then as the Nazis began to expand throughout Europe, right? And she realized like she couldn't keep them there. She started sending these dreams to friends of hers who lived outside of the reach of the Nazis, right? She left finally in 1939. She left Germany. She made her way to the United States by 1940 and settled on the Upper West Side of New York and became part of the German Jewish emigre intelligentsia community there that centered around its leading figure who came to the States 1 year later in 41, and that was Hannah Arendt. And while there's no proof that they ever met each other, because already by 33, 34, when the Nazis took over, that Arendt had been documenting anti-Semitism and its growth in Germany, and she actually fled to Czechoslovakia and then Paris. And so while they knew of each other, they didn't really meet until the Upper West Side of New York in the early 1940s. And they became not only friends, but collaborators. And so Charlotte Beradt helped Hannah Arendt translate On Tyranny into English. And on the other hand, Hannah Arendt told Beradt that she really had to pursue publishing her book on dreams in Nazi Germany. And so in 1966, and then about 7 years later, something like that, the English translation came out of a book that's called The Third Reich of Dreams. Okay. And just a nightmare of a people. And just to make a long story a little bit longer, okay, when I went to, I saw it in the secondary sources and I wanted to get a copy. This was like 2.5, 3 years ago. It turned out that if you could read German, you could get one for $13. If you wanted a copy in English, it cost somewhere between $1,300 and $1,900. Why? Because the initial copyright, of the English translation had run out, it was still in effect, and nobody could find who owned the copyright because Charlotte Beradt had died. So they couldn't retranslate it. They couldn't translate and put out a second edition. I was very fortunate in that, there it is, okay? I was very fortunate in that Temple University, my former employer, where I'm associate professor emeritus, actually had a copy. So I grabbed it, and then did something that I never do, which was it was about 129 pages. I scanned it in because, it's one thing, if somebody can get it for $15 a paperback. It's another if you're going to have to spend almost $2,000 to get it. Only shared it with a couple of people, and then thank God, and Princeton University Press, somehow they got hold of the English translation copyright, and exactly 1 year ago issued the second edition, right? So now you can get it for like $22 on Amazon. So now it is widely available, and in addition to that, that there is a Jewish woman in England, I think her name is Lorraine, a Jewish woman in England, who is now finishing a documentary on the life of Charlotte Beradt and the Third Reich of Dreams. That's going to be coming out within this year. And you can even, look up Charlotte Beradt on YouTube, documentary and that. And there's like a 25-minute, like a long teaser about it and an interview with the Jewish woman who's the filmmaker, who's doing this documentary on the Third Reich of Dreams and the ways in which authoritarianism affects our dreams. So we're going to be taking a look at that. That's what we're going to do in the first part of our session this evening. And then we are going to have the opportunity to work a dream using the projective group dreamwork method, which actually, when I was first studying it about 13, 14 years ago at the Hayden Institute in North Carolina, and they were going through this particular method, and we will go through it. I asked Mark to send it out as like a copy of the slide I'll be using to everybody so you have a sense. I was looking like, wow, this really parallels the Pardes method, the 4 levels of interpreting of Scripture that we find in actually it's in all 3 Abrahamic traditions, and it actually came to Judaism the latest of all. That already in the 9th century, the 800s, or the 8th century. It was first articulated by the Venerable Bede in England, worked its way in the later part of that century down to the Middle East, where right at the time of the Imani schism in Islam, right, that the last recognized joint caliph wrote, he did his his Muslim version of it. And then the first time that the Pardes method, this four-level method, which we think goes back to Rabbi Akiva in the 2nd century of the Common Era, that actually it doesn't appear in a Jewish text until the introduction of a translation and commentary on the Torah that appears in Jewish Spain in the 12th century. Right, so we actually came to it latest of all, you know. But I was thinking, like, whoa, you know, this all corresponds in a very real sense by consciously using this approach. What we're doing is honoring our dreams as the scripture of our lives. Right? That when we work this, you know, to a certain extent for the dreamer, in terms of looking for guidance and looking for insight from sources that we ourselves in our conscious minds did not will, right? That it recognizes a certain sanctity to the dream process. So we're going to be using that process to work. Hopefully somebody brought a dream, right? And use this process in the second part of the class, you know, because it's one thing to talk about it, it's like a whole nother thing to do it. Right, and the real magic is actually in terms of working the dreams. So that's kind of like the teaser in terms of what's coming up for tonight. So let me go back to my screen share then. And
Avruhm, if I can interrupt for a moment, is it okay
you
if people ask questions along the way if
Absolutely.
they have a question? Would you prefer they just raise their hand or put it in the chat?
I think it'd be good if people can raise their hands, perhaps. And Mark, if you could monitor that would be wonderful. Okay, just so see, you know, like, oh, you know, Avruhm, hand is up. You know, if I don't see it.
Got it.
Okay. And I don't have a problem if everybody unmutes, right? So unless you have a chainsaw going in the background, you know, and then somebody just say like it's too noisy. But other than that, I don't have a problem if people want to unmute. Okay. So I thought that we would move into the subject matter with this poem that I found last night from Langston Hughes. As I grew older, which for all of us, thank God, we're all growing older, and particularly, like, you know, 5 weeks ago, I had a pacemaker put in, so and then a week and a half later, my wife had cataract surgery, so, like, between her eyes and my heart, we know we're growing older, like, oh, we became official old people now. So this is the poem. Well, perhaps would somebody like to read the poem for us? I hear my own voice enough. Somebody willing to read the poem for us?
Well, we only have...
Oh, I heard somebody say she will.
Yes, me. I'll put my camera on.
Please.
Miriam.
Thanks, Miriam.
As I grow older, it was a long time ago. I have almost forgotten my dream, but it was there then, in front of me, bright like a sun, my dream. And then the wall rose slowly, slowly, between me and my dream, rose until it touched the sky, the wall, shadow. I am black. I lie down in the shadow. No longer the light of my dream before me, above me, only the thick wall, only the shadow. My hands, my dark hands, break through the wall, find my dream. Help me to shatter this darkness, to smash this night, to break this shadow into 1,000 lights of sun, into 1,000 whirling dreams of sun.
Of sun, right. And I was thinking particularly at this time when there's so much darkness in the world, right? Whether one is black or of any other ethnic group, right? The notion of a wall growing up between us and our dreams, particularly, you know, looking at the people's faces, you know, for many of us, this is not the America we thought we'd be living in at this particular time. That requires us to get out into the streets when we're in our 70s or young, or a little younger, or a little older, in order to to preserve this multicultural democracy that was so important to all of us, right? And so help me to break through the wall, to shatter the darkness, right? So that the light of the sun and 1,000 whirling dreams of sun can be revealed once again. So it's this kavanah that I kind of dedicate our session this evening, dealing with this whole question of dreaming in dark times. So, these are 3 quotes that I took from Sharon Slowinski's book, Dreaming in Dark Times. There are 2 books that are really, kind of like my compasses, who guide me in terms of the explorations that I and some of my colleagues are doing in terms of this dreaming in dark times. The one that I spoke to you about, of course, is Charlotte Barat's The Third Reich of Dreams, and I actually put both of these references to this book, to that book, and this one, Dreaming in Dark Times by Sharon Slowinski, in the reading list that Reb Mark sent out to the group beforehand. So you have the references to both of those books. And Sharon Slowinski actually is a professor at the University of British Columbia. She's in Western Canada, right? And she wrote this book and looking at how authoritarianism affects and persecution affects dreams, and then deals with 6 different cases. One of which is Charlotte Barat's dreaming in the Third Reich of Dreams, but also like her leadoff chapter deals with Nelson Mandela and the dreams that he had while he was imprisoned, and how it reflected in his time and then encouraged him on his march in terms of that liberation would be not only for his people but for the liberation of all. And then somebody else, how we dealt with through art, through photography, like different ways in which people dealt with, with dreaming and during dark times. And so among the things that Slowinski observed is that dreams are vehicles for otherwise unthinkable thoughts and a species of psychological work that can fold and transfigure the force of harsh realities, right? So that whether it's on an individual level or in relationship to what is going on in society, right? And particularly as she points out that particularly during times when rationality and language is being so debased, right? Like the SAVE Act is actually to disempower people from voting. Is actually a voter repression act, but we'll call it the SAVE Act, right? And she quotes Hannah Arendt and others who talk about how the fact that existentialism grew up, during the post-World War II era in Europe was because that these European philosophers saw how that if you just tried to use rationality and logic, that they could just be bent to mean anything, including the opposite of what was actually being professed. And so therefore, to call upon, and the surrealists also earlier on had this same sort of sense, and that's why they were trying to smash through, the growing tyranny, first, industrialization, and then also the authoritarian regimes that were growing up in Europe post-World War I. Right? And that there has to be a human wisdom that is richer and deeper, right? And goes beyond just whatever the laws of, whatever people can express, in terms of reason and logic, and then try to misuse in order to persuade people that black is really white and white is really black, right? And so that what she says is that our dreams, through symbolization, right, taking things that are very painful and then turning them into symbols, as Freud would talk about, and images within our dreams, allows us to, as it says here, restage conflicts in the theater of the mind, transfiguring painful experiences to emotionally digest these events in ways to keep us alive to life, right? that when things are going on in the outside world, right, anywhere from the debasement of truth to people who are finding, as Charlotte Barat writes about in the Third Reich of Dreams, who are having their citizenship and their rights taken away, and the possibility of living any kind of independent life, and the only truth is whatever the dear leader, the Fuhrer, says it is, right? And if you don't subscribe to that, then you get attacked, and then you get disappeared, right? To the extent that people are unwilling, even in their conscious minds, to allow themselves to think about what's going on. That dreaming, by opening us up to our unconscious, to the shadow aspects of disowned parts that we are maybe too afraid to talk about or to think about, or realities that we didn't know were there, like the unthought thoughts, right? That the dreams allow us to restage these, in the theater of our mind, transfiguring painful experiences, to emotionally digest these events in ways to keep us alive to life. At times where it's, just go along and whatever the dear leader says, and like wondering, like, are you the only one crazy one there? Because like what's being expressed as reality doesn't seem to be the sense of what's actually going on. And so that she actually talks about ways in which, let me just get this where I can see it here. Whoops. Oops. You know what? I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to... Sharing window was... I didn't mean to close it, but okay. Okay, so let me just put this back up again, because I couldn't... I moved your lovely faces down to where... where it turned out they were hiding what was actually in my... Okay. So that she writes here that dreams perform a number, during difficult times, dreams perform a number of functions for us, right? On the one hand, they bring us in contact with a deeper emotional truth than what one can just express, in logical, rationally, limited speech, right? It brings the images bring an emotional depth. And in addition to that, it also then allows the dream to sort of weave a womb around us. It's a container for painful experiences, give indigestible material a new form like birth that implies perennial beginnings. Okay? So that in effect, if we feel, particularly for repressed people, if you feel that the world is closing in on you, on the one hand, the dreams through the images help you to digest and to process these, right? Freud talks a lot about this, that the function of what he calls dream work, which is not, now we talk about dream work as interpreting dreams. When Freud used the term dream work, he meant what's going on in your psyche, right? While you're sleeping, in which your heart mind is transforming whatever memories and experiences and other elements, right, into images that show up as the phantasms in your mind, right? Was translating, experience and images and knowledge and reading, and dream work for him was translating these into images. And part of the reason he says that the psyche does that is that oftentimes the material that it's dealing with is just so difficult. Either it's too morally difficult, or it's too, socially unacceptable, right? And therefore, rather than admit it, particularly, and he was talking about basically, like people's deep sexual feelings, right? So whether it was socially unacceptable, morally unacceptable, aesthetically unacceptable, that he understood that part of dream thinking, the nocturnal thinking, was to transform these into images that on the one hand keeps the emotion alive, but in a way then that we can work with it, with this difficult material in ways that we might not have been able to do so with our waking minds, or even to talk to other people about them, right? So that the dreams, on the one hand, take these in. On the other hand, they sort of protect us. They put a womb around us and then allow us to give birth to transposing mental events into words. The speaker discloses her commitments to her social situation and establishes relationship with her interlocutors. Okay? Such speech acts entails a risk, indeed, the courage of truth. Okay? So that, and I'll get out screen share right now. So that during difficult times, the function of dreaming is that on the one hand, it helps us process the difficult events that are going on outside of our lives in ways that we might not even consciously being able to admit to ourselves or want to talk about with other people, either for fear that we're going to be oppressed, maybe that they're going to, take offense. How are we going to be received? Do we even want to admit out loud that this is the reality? Okay. And that the dreams, even more than just expository speech, because of the images, are fraught with emotions and the different levels of emotion. The imagery, right, that connects us to an aliveness that's actually, sometimes it's like a seismograph to aliveness not only within us, but what's going on, what are the dynamics that are going on underneath the surface that we might not find on CNN or in the New York Times or even, sometimes even talking about in public. Right? And then, these are then transformed in that aliveness. And so that's the work in terms of the dream transfiguration in your mind. But then the next part is communicating the dream, right? And she says that's a political act, right? Where people can share their dreams, right? And you're keeping your own, individuality alive, right? In the face of, whatever the empire or whatever, your social group or whoever is trying to say, no, just, don't pay attention to this, or this is not a reality, right? So that the dream kind of gives you a womb to be able to process these emotions and thoughts and things that weren't coming to the surface. And then, as we know, it's like, you just got to tell, people like, oh yeah, can I tell you my dream? And so this sharing of dreams, she says, is actually a political act. And Slowinski writes in her first chapter about Mandela, and she interviewed some of the people who were in prison with Mandela, and that they actually, so that his companions in prisons, actually they were a dream sharing group. They used to share their dreams with each other, and they also, to a certain extent, acted as his editorial board as he was writing down all of the materials that then became, he would later publish in terms of his journey towards freedom. Right? So they were sort of his editorial committee, and that they were also a dream sharing group in terms of keeping their aliveness with one another and preparing themselves for a time that they might be able to leave prison and then ultimately to become free in that way. And so that the African National Committee had this idea, which I think is so germane right now, and possibly even more germane for people in endangered communities, even more than we find ourselves, of saying, like, if you have the dream and you can hold on to it, and you have a dream of liberty, even if you don't have the means to achieve liberation at this particular time, holding on to the dream and sharing it with each other and keeping that dream alive is the first steps towards liberation, right? It might not be sufficient, but it's certainly necessary, right, in order to lead towards people achieving freedom and having that new dream of whirling suns come into being, right? And so, what I'd like to share with you, actually, to from some firsthand material, is a dream that somebody in one of my dream groups shared last week. Okay, and obviously will not be revealing the person's identity. Okay, but actually, At the end of May, I'm going to be presenting on this material at a keynote at the Hayden Conference in Hendersonville, North Carolina. It was the Hayden Institute in terms of spirituality, Judeo-Christian, Jungian tradition. And then in addition to that, and then one of my coach dream leaders and I have been invited in the middle of June to go to Ashland, Oregon to the International Association for the Study of Dreams to present on this material. So what we've been doing is conducting dream groups with people, so it's not only relying on like me quoting, Charlotte Barat or Sharon Slowinski, but also like, having primary material. Like how is our current situation affecting the dreams of everyday people? And it's interesting that this one dream group that we have that's here in Philadelphia actually none of the members of the dream group would be considered like in immediately endangered communities. They're all like, pretty middle-aged, older, and successful and these sorts of things. But the ways in which their dream, we've had 2 sessions so far, and the dreams that have been shared have been like quite remarkable. So with your permission, and I got the permission of the dreamer, I'm going to share the dream. Just to give you a sense of how, people's dreams are affected by what's going on. So this individual has a dream, and I'm going to be changing some things around to preserve anonymity. So he is in a big beautiful nature communal setting, like a big retreat center that's built on the side of a hill in a beautiful nature setting. And there are lots of people in the retreat area, in the main kind of like the main gathering area, and the person sees a number of people who were friends during high school that he knew from a number of different settings, right? And they had been friendly in that. And then someone by the name of Jim comes up to him. And he really wanted to be closer friends with Jim, and they'd been close for a while, and then somehow Jim pulled away. And so Jim comes up to the dreamer and says, well, I want to, and the dreamer says, well, no, I have an idea why our closeness kind of, got attenuated, we separated. And Jim says, no, I have something I have to tell you. There's more to it than that. And just at that time, the dreamer's wife and emerging adult daughter, who's about 20, they show up in the dream, right? And just when Jim is going to share this secret, and as they show up, all of a sudden there is this big crash, and this huge torrential storm starts outside. Okay, and that the dreamer's spouse and child, right, this emerging adult child and the spouse, the life partner, turn into puppies, little puppies, that the dreamer has to protect and shield. Okay, and the dreamer realizes, right, that this retreat center that's built on the side of a hill could very well get washed away, flooded and washed away. And then also this retreat center, as it turns out, you have this big common area, and then as you go up the hill, there are kind of like interlocking smaller rooms and little smaller houses, right, where people can stay and move in. They're all interconnected. You don't have to go outside. So she decides, like, I can't stay down here. We could get washed away down here, and climbs up to the next level, right? In the next level, right, it's just these smaller houses, much more constricted. She sees a number of people who, in the dreamer's mind, vibe like white supremacists, including, right, and everybody in the dream group is Jewish, okay, white supremacists, including a guy who's strapping on a machine gun, right, who we then referred to as machine gun guy, okay. And it's like, oh God, like I really don't want to be here, but it could be flooded away outside and that. And it was very clear that the people who were up at that level didn't want people from the lower level to come up, and disturb them. So she kind of like, but she could get flooded outside. So she kind of he kind of takes, a route and sees an elderly woman, right, in another one of these like small rooms, house areas, and starts to apologize, like, we really don't mean to invade your space, but it's, could be washed away down there and that sort of thing. And the woman says nothing, right? And this character got labeled as Silent Grandma, right? Silent Grandma says nothing, and that's where the dream ends. That's where the dream ends. Okay. So, before I, give you some, like of our interpretations of what do you think's going on in this dream? How the environment, and what's going on in our society is might have affected this dream. Right? It's a beautiful natural setting there with people that I thought were my close friends. It turns out, as we were examining more, that they were friends from youth group, but weren't really the closest intimate friends. Right? This Jim is going to reveal something, but doesn't have a chance to. Right? And somebody brought up Jim sounds like the word jinn, right? Like genie. Like his spirit. Like, is this some kind of, spirit from beyond, some kind of gatekeeper? Right, as like Silent Grandma and the Machine Gun Guy might also be gatekeepers. Like when you're ascending to levels of heaven, they're or on mystical trips, they're gatekeepers. Like, who are these people, right? And found out that the people who thought past his friends were just friends on the surface, thought that this great retreat center, in this beautiful area, and that really was not built on a solid foundation and could be washed away. Right, that moving from the communal area, the people that we thought were friends were not there really her intimates. They're not really this dreamer's intimates, right? And moving up, and then finding, Machine Gun Guy and Silent Grandma, right? And that's kind of like where dream goes. So what do you think has been in terms of the stuff we've been discussing? What do you think's going on in this dream? Please go ahead, Devorah.
Well,
everybody, you can just unmute, please.
I missed your first half hour, so I don't know what you led in with, because I just arrived for this story. But it sounds like for a person who thought his world was very stable, and this friend seemed to be approaching him to talk about why that started to fall apart. Suddenly his whole world is kind of coming apart. He can't move up, and it doesn't seem safe if there's Machine Gun Guy, and if the grandma is not talking, Silent Grandma. And he's in danger as he's moving up, maybe into a new spiritual level, that everything's also going to get washed away. So he's not feeling very secure.
Right. Thank you. Anybody else?
I was just going to say...
hi, Elizabeth, by the way.
Yeah, I made it here, and my husband's here, too, sitting next to me.
Hey, Rick.
So they're looking for solid footing, and there is none.
Right, and they thought, everything that we thought was solid and sunny and bright and beautiful, right? Kind of like when some of us were growing up, right? And even into our middle times, all of a sudden things like it could be washed away, and it's dangerous, right? And there's no solid footing, and this idea of moving up spiritually, but also you're in this big communal space, and now these are more like smaller individual spaces, and you also have to interact with people that you never thought you'd have to or want to interact with, right? But you have to somehow you have to interact with them. Right? And what is this going to mean? And are those the only two places you can move to? Or there's some others there that, like if you re-enter the dream, that you might need to explore, right? And is there salvation just, like moving up into smaller personal space? What's going to happen to the community that's down there? Okay? Where everything seemed idyllic, but the friends who I really thought were friends weren't such great friends, right? And the people who I thought were my life partners, and we could protect each other, like my spouse and my emerging adult child, all of a sudden they're like little kittens, and I got to protect them. So what does this mean, and what's this young instinctual energies that are coming out at this particular time? And how do we move into worlds that don't seem to be so hospitable to us? But you sort of. But on the other hand, can you really stay where you were, because that world's changing? It's like après-moi. Who was it? Louis XV. Après-moi le déluge. Right after me, the flood's coming. Please go ahead, Devon.
How did he feel when he woke up?
Actually, it was very interesting, because the dreamer, when we were asking like who has a dream, and finally the dreamer says, well, this is not such a big dream. I have one. It's sort of a small dream. And after we're done, like, huh? Like, really? This was not a small dream at all.
So he didn't feel anxious or anything. It just felt confusing to him. But he didn't feel scared or anything?
Well,
or he was just
it was sort of like, what is going on here? But one of the things, as was with dream groups, and that's why they're helpful, is none of us can be our own side view mirrors, right? We can't see into our own blind spots. So I'm in the immediacy of the dream. I just thought, okay. And here's, and once the group started, projecting onto the dream and then working through with some guided imagery, it's sort of like, holy shit, like for all of us. So, Rick, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was thinking at the end of the dream when he goes into this other room, and there's this elderly woman who's silent, and we would think of the elder as someone who brings wisdom, who is there to guide, yet has nothing to say. And I thought that was very profound. So he has nowhere to turn for guidance. Even from the elders are silent in the face of what's happening.
Right. So so it's so interesting, right? On the dreamer thought that the elder was silent just because the elder didn't want anybody, like those rowdy people from below, to come up to our area. Like, we don't, you will not replace us, right? We don't want to be invaded. But because the imagery is so multivalent. So Rick just brings up a point, by the way, that nobody in our dream group brought up, which was the possibility that maybe the elder isn't speaking not because she's hostile, but because she doesn't have anything to say. Like no wisdom to import. Like, how do we deal with this? This is unprecedented. Maybe she doesn't want to be in the midst of machine gun people also. So thank you for that, Rick, because it also demonstrates, like how multivalent dreams are. There's one of my favorite quotes in the Talmud about dreaming was Rabbi Banah said that he had a dream. There were 24 authorized dream interpreters in Jerusalem. He had a dream, brought the same dream to all 24 of them. Each gave him a different interpretation, and each one was right. Right? In terms of how multivalent the images are, how many different levels dreams work on, the individual, the communal, the historical, the archetypal, so it's like 24 dreams, each one interpreted differently, and each one was right.
I'm going to test that theory by proposing that I'm the one who's dreaming. So I'm looking at this, that everything is happening to me, what you shared with us. And that the both machine gun guy and the woman, the grandmother who doesn't speak, they do so because they are, the message that they're giving me is that you don't have to go any further than this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to protect you from yourself, and that you have all the answers that you need. Don't look any further. So silence speaks very loudly in our tradition.
Mm-hmm. Very much so, and also like threatening images that on the certain surface might be threatening, right? Actually, when you explore them further, or sometimes through active imagination, right, or embodied imagination, or re-enter the dream or something like that, you find that they're just there either to warn you, to protect you, to bring you a message, right? So that's why my late teacher Jeremy Taylor, and was a friend and a teacher, One of his bywords, there are no such things as bad dreams, right? They're dreams with frightening images. They're dreams that you might wind up and wake up and feel, like frightened or something like that. But usually those dreams come, those characters come to get your attention, right? Like, pay attention to me. This is important. And so one of the things that one could, do in that dream would be like to go back into the dream and then imagine you're having a conversation with Machine Gun Guy. And I'll give you an example. I've written about this a couple of times. It was one of my most important dreams, in which a friend of mine and I go into a lawyer's office, and we're sitting in the waiting room, and there's kind of like an opaque glass, where like the receptionist and the office are from, the waiting room. And all of a sudden, we see three dark figures burst in, we see them, opaquely burst into the room. We hear gunshots, and we hit the floor. That was the dream. So I, went back into the dream. I did an active imagination, like imagining I was having a conversation with the three shadowy figures. And I said to them, "So who are you?" And they said, "Well, we're bail bondsmen." Right? Yeah, and we're here to rescue you. Here to rescue me, right? Like what's all? Well, then what was all the shooting about? He said, "You didn't think you'd get out of here without some blood being spilled, did you?" So that was the interaction that I had. So what did this trigger for me? It was at a time when I was both working as the rabbi of a congregation here in Philadelphia and a full-time humanities professor at Temple University. And when I started both of those jobs, they were both about 2/3 time or whatever, so it was manageable. As I was getting older and that each job required more and more time, I realized I just couldn't do it anymore. But like financially, how was I going to give up one salary because I was a non-tenured associate professor at Temple University. So, we were kind of like 3 steps up from Walmart workers of academia. It was wonderful to teach there, but not great salary and that. So between the two, it was one salary. So like, how was I going to deal with this? And it says, bail bondsman. Oh, they're here to bail me out. And it reminded me that my father, who had passed away a few years ago, had left me some bonds. And that if I did my financial situation just right, because, there's lots of wonderful puns in dreams, and real plays on words, right? Like Jim is Jin, right? Like the genie, who is this message coming there? So we're here to, like, bail me out, right? And there are these bonds that were there. And so what was this whole thing in terms of, you're not going to get out of here without some blood being spilled? And so what reminded me was, like I had developed over 10 years, deep relationships with people in my congregation. It was a small congregation. And realizing that I couldn't just announce like, okay, I'm going to leave, this is it. So I had to be very planful in terms of, how I was going to deal with people's feelings and with the congregation and take my leave. And I had to be planful with my finances also, in terms of how I was going to, so it was like a year from the time that I had that dream, maybe until I actually retired. It was like a year process, right? And then I had a second dream within that year, which really confirmed that it was the right thing for me to do. And that was that I was at Simchas Torah services. We were dancing outside with the Torah. I was holding the Torah up like this and moving around, and I felt my arms weakening. And they said to me, "It's okay. You can put here's the table. Here's the stand. You can put the Torah down." And I realized, like, okay, that's what I needed to do, because if I didn't put the Torah down, I was going to drop it. Right, like I just didn't have the strength anymore. I was like 65, something like that, to do basically 2 full-time jobs anymore, And so therefore, it was time for me to take leave from the congregation, and so it was those 2 dreams, with particularly one with like scary dark figures who were shooting guns, right? But they were getting my attention, and they were actually there to rescue me, not to do harm. right? So like we'd want to have an imaginal conversation with Machine Gun Guy. Maybe he's there to protect us. Maybe Silent Grandma is we want you. There's no more need to be said. So thank you all for for those insights. What do we have? 20 minutes, Mark?
That is correct. And I have a question for you.
Yes.
Which is, and if you don't want to go in this direction, that's fine. A lucid dream. My understanding is that a lucid dream is one where you realize you're dreaming and you can be present and affect the course of the dream. Is
right.
that?
I'm not a lucid dreamer, and it's really not my. I've read about it, but it's really. I kind of like to keep us focused on this because I'd actually like to see if somebody has a short dream that they want to present. Okay. So let me ask the group: Does someone have a dream that she or he would like to share with us tonight? Okay, so let me. So we don't know what might be in there. So let's take a look. We'll just take a look quickly at. Okay, so here's basically the group dream work method. Okay, the dreamer will tell us the dream twice, and this is a pretty short one. We'll then have drash. That's the shot. Just what was the dream. Then we'll have inquiry, where you can ask questions of clarification, okay? In terms of like, well, what is daf yomi? What might have been happening? Were there any other settings? Any colors in that dream? Did you recognize the voice? Whatever it might be, was there anything else? Then, if Elizabeth feels comfortable, she'll give us her dream, and we'll project onto that dream. Not tell her what her dream meant, but if this had been your dream, like, what would that have meant, to have that message? And then after we give her back her dream, did any other illusions, thoughts from the mystery come up, and kind of ask Elizabeth to watch her dreams over the next weeks or so to see if anything else comes up in terms of her dream. Okay. They wouldn't try to interpret the dream. They just say good it is and good it might be, right? You don't want to say you had a bad dream because that could make openings for Satan and malevolent forces. And then the dreamer and the group the three friends, kind of like a dream beit din, would exchange antiphonally and recite 9 different verses from Scripture. 3 that deal with the word hapach, to transform, 3 that deal with the word pada, redeem, and 3 that have the word shalom, right, well-being and peace. So I took 2 of these lines and I used these where whenever we finish working with the dream to kind of like mark the sanctity of the interchange we had. So Elizabeth, if you would read the dreamer's line, and we'll read the group's line.
Adabat shalom nafsi. Through this dream, may my soul find wholeness and relief.
And we say together,
peace
unto you. And we who support you, may God always be your aid. Shalom, shalom, lach. V'shalom la'ozraich, ki azaraich Elohayich.